I want to share a little piece of advice that, had I understood this when I was younger, had I really taken it to heart, I would have progressed much further on my journey. It would have saved me a lot of time and trouble. And so I want to offer this to anyone who is on the spiritual path, regardless of where you are or what your journey looks like, but perhaps especially to those of you in the beginning stages of your awakening. I was recently listening to a reading from The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, which I had not read since probably 20 years ago. And in the third chapter, he says, "Humble knowledge of self is a surer path to God than the ardent pursuit of learning. Not that learning is to be considered evil, but a clean conscience and virtuous life ought always to be preferred. Many often err and accomplish little or nothing because they try to become learned rather than to live well." Now, I've talked about this sort of thing before, and I'll probably talk about it many more times to come because it's very important to understand, and perhaps it can't be said enough. But what is being expressed here is the importance of virtue over mere intellectual knowledge. This is a very common thing which I see all the time, especially with those just starting out on their journey. And I did this myself for many years, is that there is this tendency to gather up information, to gather up various spiritual ideas and concepts, and even to formulate some of our own theories and speculations based on what we read and hear. And what often occurs is that a person gathering up information in this way mistakes that information for actual knowing. That is, it's all borrowed information, it's all secondhand. But having understood these things by way of the intellect, by way of logic and reason, or perhaps simply believing them to be true based on authority or tradition or what have you, we often make the mistake of thinking that we actually know these things as if we've seen or experienced them for ourselves. And in some cases, we can become quite proud and arrogant having acquired this information. It can easily become food for the ego, and we may be able to articulate these things very eloquently, to speak with an air of authority or expertise, even though all we're really doing is just regurgitating information. And I find this term very useful because to regurgitate something means that you haven't properly digested it. If you had, you wouldn't be able to regurgitate it because it would have been absorbed into you. And so we take in these various spiritual ideas and concepts and so on, and we then repeat them without having first assimilated them, without embodying them, or without coming to see these things for ourselves by way of our own direct perception. And I often find that a person can be very well studied in these matters, and yet their way of life, the way they engage with others, the way they feel, all seems to indicate that they don't really understand what it is that they're talking about. For instance, though a person may be very knowledgeable in regard to spiritual matters, they may also be very egotistical or very judgmental toward others, unkind or uncaring, lacking in compassion and understanding, perhaps inconsiderate in some ways, selfish or self-absorbed, and inwardly they may be very unhappy, even miserable. They may be experiencing all sorts of emotional distress, all sorts of suffering, and not doing anything at all to address these things. So what is the value of all this information if we remain selfish and miserable? What is the value of this information if we're not cultivating virtue? As Paul wrote in his letter to the Corinthians, "If I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, but I have no love, then I am nothing." And this is not to say that this kind of information isn't valuable, but what gives it value is how it's applied, or whether it's applied at all. Because if you're not applying it, if you're not putting these principles into practice, if you're not testing it in order to verify it, then it really has no value at all. It's just dead, dry information. It's just something to keep the mind occupied. And I say this from experience because I read this wonderful advice from Thomas à Kempis a very long time ago, and for some reason I just brushed over it. I didn't really take it to heart. I simply read the words but didn't apply it. And it wasn't until many years later that I began to realize this for myself, having spent so many years just gathering information and not really getting anywhere. So what Thomas à Kempis so rightly suggests is that greater than learning, reading, studying, greater than acquiring intellectual knowledge is virtue. And that of the two, this should be our primary focus. Now, we can still read books and listen to various people talk on spiritual matters, and all of that can be quite useful in guiding us toward cultivating these virtues. But that should be our primary aim, not just to acquire information so that we can appear wise, but that we might discover true wisdom, which doesn't come from books or from any place outside of oneself. And once you begin to discover that, you'll find that you don't really need to rely so much on outside information. You have a well of wisdom within you that you can drink from anytime. So, coming back to this, to cultivating and embodying virtues such as compassion, peacefulness, clarity, gratitude, patience, sincerity, humility, and so much more, that we seek to discover these virtues within ourselves, which are already there, and to bring them out, to embody them more and more in our daily lives. Something that I often hear from those who consider themselves to be spiritual is that they have a lot of complaints about other people, those who they might consider unspiritual or unconscious or whatever terminology one might use. And it's usually things like they just don't understand me, or they're not kind to me, or they judge me or criticize me, or I just find them irritating, and all this kind of thing, which says to me that you must really value these kinds of things like kindness and compassion and understanding and so on, because you expect and sometimes even demand these things from others. And as much as we desire these things from others, how much do we embody them in ourselves? What is it that we think makes us so much more spiritual than them? We may be just as self-absorbed as they are. We may be just as judgmental. We may be just as inconsiderate. We may be just as disingenuous, especially if we're going around presenting ourselves as spiritual, but we're not embodying these spiritual principles and values. And not to say that we need to be perfect and flawless, but we should at least be making some endeavor to cultivate these things. At the very least, we should seek to be more aware of our own vices, our own selfishness, and all the ways that might be expressed, particularly in the way that we engage with others. And in fact, when we find ourselves confronted by those who seem to irritate and agitate us in so many ways, that's really a profound opportunity to work on this, to become all the more aware of our own reactivity, our own negative thought patterns, and to see if we can respond differently, to see if we can be more understanding, more patient, more forgiving, more compassionate, whatever it happens to be in that moment. If we're serious at all about our growth and awakening, this is where our focus should be, that we should always be examining ourselves in this way, reflecting upon our own thoughts and feelings and behaviors to see what needs to be addressed, what needs to be resolved, what needs to be discarded or transcended. And when we begin to engage in this way, that's when real transformation happens. That's when our whole life begins to transform. That's when we begin to discover within ourselves those very things which we've been so desperately seeking outside of ourselves, like peace and love and wisdom. That's when we really begin to awaken more and to see with greater clarity. That's when we begin to tap into that wisdom that is already within us and come to have our own insights into these things rather than relying on other people's explanations. As Thomas à Kempis also wrote, "He to whom the eternal word speaks is free from theorizing. which is another way of saying that when you open up to that universal wisdom within you, you don't need to rely on concepts and philosophical speculations or borrowed information. You begin to see these things for yourself.